IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with Kol Israel.
Terrorism's global impact. Highlights from the ICT's 11th International Conference.
Hello and welcome to the IDC Radio on 106.2 FM and 106.2fm.co.il on the internet. We're here for a special broadcast from the 11th World Summit on Counter-Terrorism held by the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism. I'm Edan Landau and I'm here with Professor Martin Kramer. Hello and welcome.
Delighted to be here.
Professor Kramer, you're a senior fellow at the Shalem Center in Jerusalem and President-designate of the Shalem College as well.
That's right.
You're here to basically talk about Hamas and Hezbollah as a hybrid organization. What will that session actually be about?
That session, which I'm chairing, is going to devote itself to two movements which are more than just terrorist organizations. They have other aspects of their infrastructure and activity, political activities, social activities, which make them terrorist organizations and something more. And the question is, what is the something more? That's what makes them hybrid. They're not like strictly like Al-Qaeda, which is a terrorist organization without a territorial base and which is devoted entirely to planning, plotting, and executing terrorist acts. These organizations also put up candidates for elections, they run social services, they do other things. Makes them hybrid. Just what that means is the question that the panel will discuss.
Okay. I want to go a bit more wide into the current events that are happening in the Middle East. We've seen many changes in the last few years, and yet it feels a bit that these changes skipped over both Hamas and Hezbollah. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. They very much sat out the Arab Spring. In the case of Hezbollah, while it has been anxiously watching events in Syria, as have other Lebanese, Lebanon has basically been out of the loop as far as the Arab Spring, and I think also in the case of Hamas, the Palestinians have been very much out of the same loop. I think partly because of their own dynamics, partly because of measures that Israel has taken. In fact, one could well argue that the whole move towards the Palestinian attempt to get a declaration of statehood at the United Nations is to put the spotlight back on them after, well, half a year in which it has been elsewhere on other Arabs in the street protesting and paying a price. So I think that Hezbollah and Hamas have been observers and not participants in the Arab Spring. But I think that there's much to say about the opportunities and the risks that they see in the Arab Spring.
Hezbollah has been more vocal about support in the Arab Spring, especially in Libya, I think, and Egypt as well. And at some point, they did claim to have some kind of foothold in the whole process that was going on. Is that true? I mean, did Hamas or Hezbollah actually have any part in instigating the turmoil?
I don't know if they had a part in instigating the turmoil. Certainly they've been aligned, certainly Hezbollah has been aligned with Iran's position. Iran has welcomed the changes that took place in Egypt and in Tunisia, and even in Libya. And there they claim to have actually played some sort of role. Iran's interest is in presenting the Arab Spring as the culmination of their efforts to have the despots removed and replaced with an anti-Western order. The problem, of course, for Iran and for Hezbollah is the Syrian component, because then it gets, if Syria were to spin out of the axis, that line, or its key position as the link between Iran and Hezbollah, obviously both the state of Iran and the movement of Hezbollah would face a very difficult situation. So I would say that their perspective on this right now is a bit conflicted. But the fact is that the regime in Syria is still in place, whereas the regimes in Egypt and Tunisia and apparently also Libya are gone. So I would say that in in looking over the balance sheet of the Arab Spring for Hezbollah, it's probably a net gain at this point.
I see.
As far as Hamas, I mean, Hamas is a sister or brother movement to the Muslim Brotherhood. And obviously the additional latitude that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Tunisia now have and conceivably will have in Libya can only benefit them. So I think that from their point of view, although they've been observers of this process, they can also see so far, from their perspective, net gains in what has happened.
If we look at the regimes around us as being unstable at some point, the leadership, and Hamas and Hezbollah both having a very definitive structure, how stable are they? That structure, how stable is it compared to the regimes around us?
Well, they do have state-like structures because remember that unlike other Islamist movements, they have territory, geographic territory. They administer the territory. Hamas, quite explicitly, Hezbollah de facto. So they have state-like apparatuses to do so. They have structured leaderships. If the question is whether they are as vulnerable as, say, some of the regimes in the region, it's an interesting question. It's very hard to say. Certainly there is, both in Lebanon and in Gaza, Gaza being where Hamas holds sway, dissatisfaction with the performance of the two movements. But I would be hard-pressed to imagine in either scenario a movement from within of protest, such as we've seen in other Arab countries. I think it's partly because they're better at suppression. I think that also because they don't actually have formal state authority, they are not yet considered the regime, and they haven't been in power that long. Remember, I mean, if you look across North Africa, you have regimes which have been in power for decades. Yeah. Several generations have come to maturity under these regimes, and that creates a different dynamic than in a situation like Gaza, where Hamas has held sway for 4 or 5 years, and Hezbollah, where it's been very informal, and there's still a Lebanese government. So, so I would not expect at this point in time for there to be an upsurge among, say, Lebanon Shiites or the population of Gaza against the regimes, filling public squares and so forth against Hezbollah and Hamas.
How reliant are they on their leaders? I mean, their leadership itself. If we look at the other countries, as you mentioned, that have been around for decades, the leadership or the supreme leader was the one that was basically controlled the environment. And in Hamas and Hezbollah, you also see, at least in Hezbollah, the leadership does have an important role. But how reliant is the organization on that leader to the extent that if he's removed, the organization collapses and disappears? Mm-hmm.
Well, the main characteristic of the Arab regimes was the alliance between a leader and the military and the security services. I think in both the case of Hezbollah and Hamas, you have alliances. In Hezbollah, it's the clerical establishment with the military wing. And in Hamas, it's the political leadership with a military wing. I suppose the difference between them and the Arab regimes is that the regimes are not, certainly in the case of Hamas, as personalized. I mean, Israel's eliminated a number of leaders of Hamas over the years, and new ones have come to the fore because there's, I think, a more collective or collegial leadership. And so people don't identify the Hamas regime with, say, Ismail Haniyeh, who was the prime minister. It is not as personalized. Hezbollah is another story. I mean, increasingly we've seen in recent years a cult develop around the personality of Hassan Nasrallah, so that it is more focused on the individual. But one must remember that in the past, too, Israel eliminated leaders of Hezbollah. There have been Hassan Nasrallah's predecessor was eliminated, and so I think in Lebanon there's more of an identification of Hezbollah with the one leader There, too, it's not nearly as deep as, say, the Egyptian regime was identified with Hosni Mubarak, or the Tunisian regime with Ben Ali, or Libya with Gaddafi. I mean, Gaddafi was ruled by Libya when I was a student. We're talking about over 40 years ago. So again, there aren't the layers of experience which would turn these movements into movements that are personally identified with the leader. By the way, we do have terrorist movements which are strongly identified with one leader. The PKK and Abdullah Öcalan is a clear identification. The movement and the man are one. And then in those movements you have a more cult-like adherence to the word of the leader. Remember, too, that in Hezbollah, where I said that there's more of a cult of the leader Nasrallah, even he, though, defers to Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. He doesn't claim to be the leader. In fact, it's Khamenei who has the title of supreme leader, and to whom Nasrallah defers. So it's a bit of a different situation than it is with the Arab regimes.
Okay, if we were to focus on Lebanon, Lebanon has been actually quite unstable for the past few years, with the regime changes, attempts to overthrow the government in 2008 by force. To what extent is Hezbollah actually calling the shots in Lebanon?
Well, I think to a very large extent, Hezbollah has an effective veto over the Lebanese government. We see that manifest itself in the whole Hariri episode. This is not to say that Hezbollah calls all the shots, but an effective veto means that Lebanon cannot move forward, back, right, or left without Hezbollah's agreement. And this is because, not just because of Hezbollah's cohesiveness and its maneuverability, but also because the demographics are there. I mean, it's a sectarian country. The Shia have a demographic predominance in the country, and Hezbollah has a political predominance among the Shia. One might call it a kind of a shadow government in Lebanon, in which Hezbollah effectively can check any move by the Lebanese government, certainly a move that would take it away from the preferences of Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran.
What would actually happen if Assad, if and when Assad's regime collapses? What will happen to Hezbollah, to Lebanon itself?
Well, you're getting into the realm of predictions. It's very hard to tell what will happen, but one can anticipate the difficulties that Hezbollah would face. Remember that its principal supply line has been through Syria. Iran supplies Hezbollah via Syria. And Iranian-Syrian relations have been crucial for opening space for Hezbollah within Lebanon. And one of the things that certainly must disturb people in Hezbollah is to see that many of the demonstrations in Syria against the regime have also had slogans against Hezbollah. And we've seen time and again demonstrators carrying signs and shouting slogans against Iran and against Hezbollah, and portraying the Syrian regime as a tool in the hands of both. If that regime were to disappear, then Hezbollah and Iran would have to find some other way to maintain their intimate connection, especially if a regime in Damascus were intent on actively interfering and disrupting the connection. I think that the fact that Iran wants to become more active in the Mediterranean with its naval forces is maybe an indication of some contingency planning for just that scenario. We know that the Turks had intercepted an Iranian arms shipment by sea sent to Hezbollah. I would imagine that this is already sort of pre-positioning in the event that Syria spins out of the Iran-Syria-Hezbollah axis. So it could conceivably leave Hezbollah out on a limb, quite literally, out there in the far end of the Shiite world, at the very edge, without a connection. Iran has today much more influence in Iraq than it had before, and so that does create the possibility that pressure could be placed on even a new regime in Syria to continue to facilitate the connection between Iran and Lebanon. But I think that Hezbollah would, like everyone else in the region, be entering into a period of uncertainty and would have to adjust accordingly.
You mentioned before Hariri. Mm-hmm. Recently, the United Nations-backed Special Tribunal to Lebanon published the indictments on the Hariri case. Hezbollah was mentioned there, I think, only twice, but it wasn't actually implicated. Why is that, considering that the four main suspects are related to Hezbollah?
Well, you didn't have to name the movement to understand that that the four main suspects, who are also key figures in Hezbollah, are Hezbollah. And that is why the movement and its leaders, especially Nasrallah, have been so vocal against the tribunal, calling it a tool of, actually a tool of Israel and the West, a means by which to defame Hezbollah. I think it's pretty clear that the tribunal's findings point in the direction of Hezbollah, and this has created a problem for Hezbollah domestically. Because remember, Hezbollah's key message to the Lebanese public these past few years is that we are a Lebanese liberation movement. Pay no attention to Ayatollah Khamenei, pay no attention to the Islamic trappings. We are the defenders of Lebanon. And therefore, as defenders of Lebanon, we are also entitled to keep our militia. All the other militia have disbanded, but we, as defenders, are entitled to keep our arms, to keep our rockets, to keep our capabilities, because we're defending Lebanon. And here you have an accusation that this movement, which claims to defend Lebanon, killed the prime minister of the country. And it's a total contradiction. And so it puts them in a very problematic situation. So, of course, they're denying the findings of the tribunal. But some of the evidence is persuasive.
Do you think it will have any effect on the organization, including the ensuing trial when it starts?
Well, we'll see if there is ever arrests in a trial. I mean, this is again rather off on the horizon, if at all. But it's put them back on their heels, and they will be hard pressed to establish a Lebanese bona fides. If a large section of the Lebanese public actually comes to believe that they were responsible for killing Lebanon's prime minister.
With all the unrest around Israel and the specific challenges that both Hamas and Hezbollah pose to face themselves, what are the chances of war actually breaking out between Israel and the two organizations?
Well, again, you're getting into the realm of prediction. And
you can answer yes and why not.
For
both sides.
Let's say, first of all, what we've seen so far. The 2006 Lebanon war, problematic as it was from an organizational point of view and a strategic point of view from Israel's end, still had a deterrent effect on Hezbollah. This has not been these past few years an opportune time for them to provoke, drag, incite Israel to engage in another round. The same can be said for Hamas. I think the Gaza war, and again with all the problematic, has had a deterrent effect. And we saw, in fact, the way in which Hamas very quickly tried to put a damper on the tensions that arose from the terror act against Israel in near Eilat. So there are Israel is and these two movements are at the current moment in time in a situation where no side has an interest at this moment in escalation. But look, it's a very fluid dynamic around us. It's not impossible that Iran could egg on Hezbollah in a certain scenario. I don't think it's particularly in Iran's interest at this moment either. They're obviously looking ahead to the day when they will meet Hezbollah's capacities because their own nuclear project will be threatened by the United States or Israel, and that day has not come. In fact, if anything, Israel is saying that that moment has been delayed. But one could imagine scenarios, if one wants to be speculative, where the calculus could change. And one could imagine scenarios in which Hamas is egged on by the International Muslim Brotherhood or some other, some faction thereof which has an interest in escalation. Experts will always give you an analysis which is based on what they know and what seems to be the present trajectory. The problem in the Middle East is that what seems to be the trajectory today may not be the trajectory tomorrow, and other factors could change. So if we were just to plot out the current trajectory, unlikely to see such a war. But it was unlikely that we would see revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, and they happened. So who knows?
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
הרדיו הבינתחומי 106.2 FM